Okay, so I'm going to talk about rural-urban migration, gender and education. This is a comparative study of the well-being and education of migrant girls, rural migrant girls in Shenzhen in China and Mumbai in India. I'm going to start off with some background information about migration in the two countries. I'm going to go quickly through my research methods, but obviously I think the most interesting part are the findings, so I'm kind of going to cut to those quickly, but if you've got questions about the research methods, we can come back to it. I'm then, when I've talked about what I actually found in the two countries, I'm going to try to reflect a little bit at the end about some of the methodological challenges and issues that I came up against in conducting this research. Now, in my abstract, I actually promised to solve these challenges, but I think that might be a little bit ambitious, so I might stick to just raising the challenges, and hopefully we can try and solve them together in the discussion. All right, so starting with India, just some background information about migration. Recent estimates, although I think the reality is that nobody really knows very accurately at all, which is a methodological issue, but recent estimates put the number of internal migrants in India at around the 100 million mark. Of these migrants, the fastest growing migration type, according to the National Sample Survey figures from 2010, the fastest growing type is rural to urban. Now rural migrants make up around 35% of India's urban population. And within that, we have seen a marked increase in the migration of women and children. Again, according to the National Sample Surveys, around 46% of women in urban areas are migrants compared to 26% of men. So this is a substantial change from a couple of decades ago. And finally, again, I think slightly questionable figures here, but apparently a third of those 100 million internal migrants are children accompanying their parents. So this category I'm focusing on, migrant children, is a very sizable group. And the same in China. Again, we really don't know how many internal migrants there are, but recent figures suggest around 260 million, of whom I think around 210 million, based on the 2011 census, are rural-urban migrants. They now make up around 37% of China's urban population, so very similar to India. Again, as in India, we've seen a noticeable increase in the migration of women and children, moving away from the sole migration of men. According to figures from the All China Women's Federation, 51% of migrants are women. And again, from the same survey, 35.8 million migrant children are now living in urban areas. So again, a very sizable numbers. We're talking about large numbers of migrant children in the urban areas of both countries. I'm going to whiz through what the existing literature says about this, largely because it doesn't say very much. And I've actually got the kind of graphic that I've come up with to try and show what the existing literature covers for the two countries and where the gaps might be. I hope this works on my PowerPoint. Okay, starting with India, there is some literature on the impact of migration on children's education. I know that that has been studied. But most of the literature that exists on that tends to focus on seasonal and circular and rural to rural migration. There is a lot on children in rural to rural migration. There is comparatively very little of the Indian literature, I think, on household rural to urban migration, and very little, again, on gender, or the migration of women, especially in that rural to urban migration stream. I'm going to come back to this problem when I talk about the methodological challenges at the end, but one of the key things that I found in comparing the literature on India with the literature on China is that in the Indian context, there is quite a lot of relevant literature about the urban poor, many of whom will be migrants, but that migrant itself was not used as a key category of analysis. And we see something very similar when we look at left-behind populations. Left-behind itself is not a key category of analysis in the Indian context, whereas of course, it is very much in the Chinese, which I'll come back to. Okay, looking at China now, there's a lot on the impact of migration on children's education, a particularly large amount in the Chinese context. And unlike in India, a lot on rural-urban migration, including the migration of women. I actually think there's more in the Chinese literature about the migration of young unmarried women now than there is about male migration. But there's not very much on household migration and not very much at all on married women. They seem to be excluded in the stuff on gender and migration. And there's none at all, as far as I am aware, on migrant children disaggregated by gender. So children are treated as a homogeneous mass rather than broken into boys and girls. And in China, of course, there is a lot of emphasis in the literature on migrant and left behind as specific categories for analysis. And obviously, this stems, at least in part, from the legal and institutional differences that exist in China because of the household registration system, the hukou, between migrants and the urban poor. And I'm going to come back to that and talk about that at the end. OK, this is my attempt at a diagram. I hope it works. So these two blobs represent China and India. This represents existing work on rural-urban migration, which covers very largely research on China and very little of research on India. Here we have the research on rural-rural migration, of which there's quite a lot in India, but none at all, as far as I'm aware, in China, really very, very little. Here we've got two blobs in the Chinese context, the migration of women and the left-behind population, which I've put entirely within China because I think it's a peculiarly Chinese concept, the left-behind. And that doesn't apply at all to the Indian case, where we have a lot of literature on urban poor, slum dwellers, particular problems that they might face. And in practice, a lot of those will be migrant populations, either first or second or third generation migrants, but a very relevant category. And then I've put migrant children here between the two countries, because it has partly been focused on in the Chinese context within rural-urban migration. But in the Indian context, work on migrant children covers far more rural-rural migration. And my work here on migrant girls, I'm going to put between the two, because it doesn't fall, as far as I'm aware, into the existing research on China or on India. So that I've left it kind of white, blank, falling between these two large bodies of literature. All right, I'm going to whiz through the research methods. This talk is based on 14 months of fieldwork, 7 months in each of Mumbai and Shenzhen that I conducted for my PhD thesis between 2007 and 2009. I did in-depth interviews in each city with rural migrant parents and children. Children were all aged between 6 and 12. I was interested in primary level education, so I chose children who were aged between 6 and 12, both at the time of migration and at the time of interview. And my sample was found mostly through door-to-door surveying, with also some snowballing sampling for the children, the child population. And I interviewed 136 parents and 80 children in India, in Mumbai, and 92 parents and 66 children in China, in Shenzhen. I carried out these interviews on construction sites and slums in Mumbai and in migrant living communities in Shenzhen. And as a way of getting to these populations and sort of becoming familiar with the communities and increasing my acceptance there, I taught English in informal NGO schools in India and in private migrant-run schools in China. I'll talk a little bit about what those are in a moment. Okay, I'm going to come straight on to the findings, but as I said, you can come back. I'm very happy to talk about the research methods if you want to. And I'm going to talk first about education, and then I'm going to talk about well-being more broadly defined. And I'm going to start with India, as we're in India, and then I'm going to come on to China. So my first finding about migrant girls, remember this is in the 6 to 12 age group, was that after migration in India, in Mumbai, migrant girls are out of school, a large number. I found, compared to before migration, where 86% of my sample had been in school, only 73% were in school after migration. And furthermore, there was a distinct gap between the enrollment rate and the attendance rate at school after migration, only for girls. If we look at migrant boys of the same age, their enrollment and reported enrollment and attendance rates are exactly the same. But for girls, there is a gap. Why were these girls out of school after migration? The large majority of those who were not in school were actually doing domestic work and childcare in the home. So they were, in a sense, doing child labour, but not paid labour, domestic work at home. And I found that this pattern of girls missing school to stay home and do this domestic work had a very strong relationship with mothers' paid work. So the mothers, when the mothers entered paid labour after migration, which they did in large numbers compared to before migration, where they may have been in labour but not paid labour, when the mothers entered paid labour, girls would therefore stay home from school to carry out these domestic duties. And in fact, of those girls whose mothers worked in paid labour after migration, I found only 60% of those girls would attend school regularly. A slightly larger number were enrolled, but they were not in practice attending. So girls effectively took over the role that their mothers had performed in the home. childcare for younger siblings, and housework. And I should note here that this was a complete contrast from the pattern I found with boys. I found that, in fact, boys were more likely to attend school if their mothers worked, because by their mother providing an extra income for the household, the income of the sons that they could have earned themselves in child labour, paid labour, was not needed, so the funds were available to send them to school. The second finding, a less important finding here, but still interesting, especially when we compare it to China, is that more girls than boys would attend only informal school. So I have a slightly higher proportion of girls than boys attending NGO classes, let's say, NGO schools in slums, or makeup classes on the construction sites that were provided by NGOs. Now, clearly these NGOs were filling an important gap in providing this kind of education. But having taught there and observed their classes, I would say it was a much less comprehensive education than the children would have received in a state school. Now, why are girls going to these schools and boys are not going in such high numbers? Again, this relates to chores and childcare. The NGO schools were closer to their homes, had much more flexible hours, and the girls could have fit it around their domestic work that they were doing while their mothers were in paid labour. Okay, I'm going to come on to the pattern in China. The first thing that I found, very few girls were out of school. I think I only found 3 in my whole Chinese sample, so that's a big difference between the two countries. But I did find that girls enrolled late, that after migration, younger girls would be enrolled in school aged 7 or aged 8 instead of aged 6, and this is largely because of the high cost of schooling after migration. This was already a problem before migration. The higher proportion of girls than boys were enrolled in school late, especially where there were older siblings already in school. But this pre-migration gap in enrollment age got wider after migration. A more important finding, and one which relates to the second finding I gave for India, is that girls would attend informal school. A much higher proportion of girls than boys attended private migrant school after migration. I have to say that the absolute majority of both sexes of children were in private migrant school rather than state school after migration, but it was noticeable that a higher proportion of girls were attending these kinds of informal school. And now these kinds of informal schools, for those who don't know in China, are semi-legal schools. They're run for profit, they charge fees, and they are set up to cater specifically to the needs of migrant populations who don't have the requisite documents to get into Chinese state schools. They are not registered with the state, the large majority, so they are very vulnerable to closure at any time, which makes these children's education in those schools very tenuous. Now, why are more girls attending these kinds of schools? More girls than boys lack the essential documents that they needed for state school entry. Female births might be unregistered in China because of China's very strict family planning system and also hukou system. Particularly the fact that in rural areas, families may be allowed to have a second child if their first is a girl. We might find several female births are concealed so that the family can try again for a son, meaning that girls do not have the identity documents they need to enroll in state schools. Of course, we also find that parents in some areas just made more effort to enroll their sons in state school because they thought the education of boys was more important. And I would say that this had a serious impact on the quality and the stability of girls' education by attending only these informal schools. Okay, I'm going to come on to a broader category of well-being now, and I'm back to India. My first finding here was that when asked where they were happier living, in India, girls overall preferred living in their home villages than living in the city. 54%, a narrow margin, preferred village life before their migration, compared to 58% of boys. So boys, on the whole, slightly preferred the city. And I found this preference was very strongly associated with attending school. So girls who were in school in the city had much higher rate of preference for life in Mumbai as opposed to their home village. Girls also missed their extended family in the village far more than boys seemed to. And I wondered if this related to support with domestic tasks as well as, affectionate relationships, but also a number of family members there on hand to do childcare and domestic work. But when I asked the parents, they gave slightly different answers. I asked parents where they thought was better for their daughters and their sons to live. Now, of the parents of girls, 45% preferred the city, 42% the village, and 13% didn't know. So we've got fairly evenly split with a slight preference for the city. And this is quite different from boys. Some parents, especially mothers, talked about the city as being a freer place for their daughters, which I found quite interesting. And of those parents, 56% wanted their girl to settle in the city when she was grown up, compared to 51% who wanted their son to settle in the city. So we see a stronger preference for the city for girls. Why is this? Lots of mothers talked about their own increased autonomy in the city when I asked why the city was good for girls. Rather than discussing their daughter's current situation, they talked about their own life in the city, that they played a larger role in family decision-making after migration, particularly with an increased distance from their in-laws, their husbands' families. And this relates very strongly, I found, with entry into paid labor. So maternal autonomy was improved in those households where the mother did start doing paid labor after migration. Even if she had worked before migration, the fact that the labor was paid and therefore much more visible after migration, I found made a large difference. But of course, in the Indian context, we have to balance this increase in maternal autonomy with a negative impact that I've just talked about on their daughter's education, that girls would miss school so that their mothers could go to work. And this was particularly true in very strictly regimented sorts of work, like construction with very strict hours. I found it was slightly better where mothers were domestic servants, and they had much more flexible hours on the whole. They could negotiate it around some domestic duties and also taking their daughters to school. In China, we see a similar pattern, but on a slightly different scale. So both boys and girls in China said that they preferred to live in Shenzhen than in their village home. But girls preferred the cities much less than boys. So 63% of girls, compared to 84% of boys, said that they enjoyed living in the city more. And again, there was an association with school. So the type of school attended. If they attended state school, they were much more likely to prefer the city. And they also talked a little bit about types of fun in the city, but I'll skip past that. But when I come to parents, I find overwhelming preference in China for the city, for daughters. 89% of parents of girls said that the daughters were much better in the city than in the village. And this seems surprising given the very strong criticism that lots of parents made about the awful schools that their daughters went to. So again, and 76% wanted their daughters to settle in the city, again, much stronger than for sons. Reasons that parents gave included things like less sex discrimination in the city. They wanted their daughters to make urban marriages, not go back to the village and marry a rural man. They wanted their daughters to find an urban job. And again, exactly as I found in India, I found that mothers, especially mothers in paid labor, emphasized their own increased autonomy after they moved to the city. They had a larger role in family decision-making, and again, this distance from in-laws, the husbands' families. So as in India, I found that maternal autonomy was strongly connected with their entry into paid labor, but unlike in India, this came without the negative impact on daughters' school attendance. So I'm going to conclude by just reviewing these findings and suggesting some reasons for that difference. So in both countries, the negative impact of migration on education was worse for girls than it was for boys. Also, in well-being terms, girls were less happy with migration than boys in both countries. In India, this had an impact on girls' attendances at school, and this relates to mothers' work and, of course, gender roles. I mean, structurally, it's mothers entering paid labor, but gender roles are, of course, what dictates that it's girls who take on household tasks, not boys. In China, the impact was on school type, that they go to a more informal type of school. And this obviously relates to institutions like state family planning, household registration system, but again, gender roles. Of course, it's gender roles that determine that it's girls whose births might be not registered rather than boys. In terms of the mother-daughter relationship, positive effects of migration on married women in both countries, entry into paid labor, distance from in-laws, leading to greater autonomy. But in India, a negative effect on daughters' education. And the reasons I would ascribe this to are a larger number of children, so that there's more childcare work to be done, more domestic work to be done, partly because of worse living conditions in the city, and stricter gender roles, dictating that, unlike in China, where some domestic tasks were shared between husband and wife or boy and girl children, in India it tended to fall much more strongly on the female members of the household. So I suggest that there is a different mechanism in each country, but very similar outcomes, a worse educational and worse well-being impact for girls in both countries, despite an improvement for married women, mothers, in both countries. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to finish up with a very brief overview of the methodological questions that I think this raises. And these, I've divided them into different categories, but these overlap very strongly. So first is the literature, as I already tried to suggest with my crazy diagram. Different categories of overlapping literatures which relate to the issue of household rural-urban migration. So if you start looking in the Indian literature for left-behind children, you don't find anything at all, because this category of left behind is not a central category of analysis. My problem was more that when I look for migrants in Mumbai, migrants in the city, I don't find very much. But if I start looking at the issues faced by slum dwellers, it turns out that a lot of the people in particular slum areas I was looking at are, of course, migrants, whether maybe not first-generation migrants, but they are still migrants. And yet migrant is not the key category. I think this relates very strongly to conceptual issues. There are conceptual differences between the two countries in the understanding of migration. What does it mean? Is it rural-urban, seasonal, rural-rural? How do we say what migration is? Migrant, who is a migrant? In China, you know, you're a migrant. Whether you are a first generation or a second generation, you're a migrant. You hold a rural hukao, you have a rural household registration, you're a migrant. In India, if you're a third generation migrant, you probably just think you come from Bombay or you think you come from Delhi. You may have a lot of connections with your place of origin, but you're a city person. Again, left behind, urban poor. In China, we don't really have an urban poor in the same way as we do in India. This relates, of course, to different historical and institutional settings. In China, because of this historical distinction between rural and urban, legal and administrative division, that doesn't happen in India. A much stricter history of migration control in India, so that migration is a much newer phenomenon compared to multi-generational migrants in India and the corresponding shifts of identity that these second generation and third generation migrants might go through. And of course, much greater, I think, ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and religious differences among migrants in India. Finally, not a specific migration problem, but context-specific indicators. I want to suggest that there's a real challenge in developing conceptually valid indicators, particularly in my case, for gendered outcomes across countries. So what might count as an increased level of autonomy for married women after migration in India would not count as an increased level of autonomy in the Chinese context because of different background levels of development, different levels of education among the migrant parents, different family relationships and structures. It's very difficult, I found, to find some comparison, especially in a multi-case like this where I am comparing not only before migration with after migration, but India with China. It becomes very complex indeed. Now, I don't have the answers to any of these questions, really, so I'm very happy to throw it open to people in case you have comments or suggestions or answers for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for an interesting comparison between the similarities and dissimilarities in what is obviously a hugely happening phenomena in both India and China. I'm now, before I open the floor for questions, how much time do we? 5 minutes for Q&A. All right, then in which case I'm going to open the floor to questions and save my comments for the end of the session so we can get in as much as possible. I've just been told that we really have only 10 minutes overall for Q&A. So may I ask you all to please not go into huge, comments as such, but limit your interventions to direct questions as far as possible to both Ashok and Charlotte. Thank you very much. Yeah, we do have another session. I'm sure they can see the program. All right, so just 10 minutes, please. Go ahead, sir.
Congratulations. Pursuing research from JNU, I am working for sustainable alternative. One thing is that the first paper is very excellent, but one thing, your pronunciation is not linked with Indian. Moreover, it is more Oxford style. But you have not mentioned the union affiliation. If you see the union affiliation being a centralized communist party in China, that you have not mentioned whether they are related to this is independently, neutrally working union, arranged the strike for more democratization, because if you see yesterday TV news, day before yesterday TV news in Hong Kong, democratization is coming on, whether it is unions, non-unions. And you are not affiliated with it belongs to affiliated with CPM or Communist Party of China. It should be mentioned. If the union interrelated
Okay,
with
sir,
China,
thank you.
with China, the demands will be approved. If it is a non-communist, it will be suppressed. So most of the accurate monolithic work is missing in this into analysis. This is my comment only. Thank you very much for your work. The pronunciation, I like it very much. The second paper is more than excellent because I can't put questions anything, but you have not mentioned about the dropouts. Because the dropouts comes up, whether it is in Bombay or in China, dropouts will come up. You have not mentioned the dropout rate, whether it is girls or boys. Among the migrants, they recruited, they make entry into the school admitted, after that dropout will come. And
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, sir. Okay, do you have a question?
Yes.
Right, thank you very much. Next question, please.
Thank you. I'm trying to, sorry. Excellent talk. Excellent talk. My question is related with the dynamics of dowry in India and China. What happens in, because you said parents in China prefer their daughters to move to urban areas because that's about better marriage, better prospects. Now in China, to the best of my information, the boy pays the dowry to the girl. In India, it's the other way around.
It's right price.
So basically, did you study, maybe just informally, did you touch upon that aspect? Why do Chinese parents prefer their girls to be based in the cities?
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to take one more question before I allow please, go ahead.
I will have a little larger issues in the sense that both the papers, I just want to understand that how do you understand this process of how to locate these spaces, like cities, in the entire process of negotiation and contestation, and does this open to a new alternative to look at urban identity?
Your question is to her since she's talking about rural urban. Okay, right. I'm going to open the floor first to you, Ashok, since you were the first speaker, and then Charlotte. Thank you.
I guess I'll just quickly address that. Thanks for the compliment on the pronunciation. I actually hate my accent, but that makes me feel happy. The second point is on the question of affiliation. Yeah, it's not affiliated with the state union, but no riots and strikes are actually affiliated with the state union. And by and large, it's because the hegemony of that union, or that state infrastructure apparatus, that you see this kind of shift away from it. And in India, the union was affiliated with the independent new union, trade union federation, trade union initiative, NTUI, which was an affiliate union. On the last question, I'll just quickly
Sorry, but you didn't answer. In China, was the strike at all orchestrated and...
not at all.
So this was a spontaneous workers' uprising?
I don't know if spontaneous is the word to use, but I would say that if workers were... that's why I use the phrase collective bargaining by riot. Because there isn't the infrastructure to mediate that, you see the kind of movement outside of that kind of infrastructure and that kind of taming of worker militancy. And then on the question of cities, I'll just quickly say, what you see in Bangalore in particular, because it's not purely based as a sort of industrial city, is that you do see a shift away from the city, the kind of neo-Hausenization that some urban theorists have talked about, away from a city as a point of production to a point of consumption, and movement outside to the periphery of the city, and production is moving to the periphery of the city.
Okay, Charlotte, please.
Yeah, okay. You asked about the dropout rate. Yes, perhaps I didn't explain very clearly, but that's what I was getting at when I said about different rates of enrollment and actual attendance for girls. So I only found that really for girls. Shall I carry on?
Raise your voice.
Yes, I can do that.
Sorry.
Okay, so the dropout rate is exactly what I was trying to highlight there for girls and only in the Indian context, not at all in China. Question about bride price and dowry. Yeah, very interesting. This was sorry. The mic is on? Okay. The question about bride price and dowry, yeah, this was a major concern in India. That, in fact, for parents whose daughters were out of school, I found that this was often used as a kind of rationalization, whether a post hoc rationalization, I don't know, but that they would express the fact that, of course, it's much easier to marry a less educated girl to a less educated husband, and they don't have to provide such a large dowry, so this was a sort of win-win situation. In China, you're right that there more traditionally is a bride price, but I don't think currently that's really a consideration for parents at all. The desire for parents to keep their daughters in the city and have them make urban marriages is not about financially what the husband could bring to the marriage. It's about an urban attitude, what are seen as urban attitudes, but also particularly about the hukou system of household registration, that they want their daughter to become urban, they want children of that marriage to be urban in as much as possible. Then you asked, there was another question about urban identity. Yes, you asked about urban identity. Yeah, this is something really interesting for me, but very difficult to get to grips with. About to what extent migrants are making a new urban identity. I mean, there is a big debate about this in the Chinese context, about whether the migrants can be seen as new city people with the current household registration system. No. If the changes that are being proposed to the household registration system now come into effect, this might become looser. It may be possible for migrants to forge a new urban identity. Because in my sample here, I was only looking at migrants who'd come within the last 5 years, I would say that a new urban identity was not really an issue. But one thing I would like to note is that for both countries, I found that there was a reluctance for migrants to return to live long-term in their native area. So contrary to what the literature led me to expect, most migrants did not want to go back to rural areas to live permanently. And therefore, ultimately, the question of what kind of new urban identity will they be able to forge is one that is going to be very pressing.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions for both of you, but like I said earlier, I'm going to save them towards the end. I'm going to now invite Danielle.
Might ask your question while we're waiting for it to...
Oh, all right. In which case, really... my question to you, Ashok, I mean, you know, from your example where you say that workers actually, the supplier side of the equation in this global capitalism is actually getting strengthened and creating greater bargaining power, not just for the companies who are now being identified as partners with global multinational corporations, but it's also in a certain way empowering the bargaining powers of the workers because they're directly dealing with their employer. I want a little bit greater comment on that because, you know, I'd like a little further comment on it. Let me just finish. For Charlotte, I think, I mean, you know, you really can't at all understand anything about migration in China without doing a far greater detailed study about the debates around the hukou. Those are not only fundamental in terms of identity formation today, but are very, very closely linked to one of the most important economic reforms, both at the policy and development levels that might or might not take place in China, but is really an avenue. That is the role of private property. You know that the whole hukou system is really based around the fact that migrants are seen to have rights because they have a right to that little village plot of Liang Muti or back home, and therefore are not eligible for the social policies that exist. So I you know, a little further clarification on that. Thank you very much. But apart from that, both extremely interesting papers. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. Sorry, I didn't. That's the main thesis of the paper, the thrust of the paper. The argument is that, obviously, that what you've seen in monopoly capital 150 years ago, or 120 years ago, there were hundreds of automobile factories. And the workers at those factories were small, sort of, it wasn't petty bourgeois, it was early industrial, but, you know, those got agglomerated, and smaller ones became larger ones. Other small ones vanished, and you saw monopoly capital. And then in the turn of the century, you saw the ability, because of greater value capture and sunk costs, the ability for workers to make demands on their immediate employer. You've seen a similar phenomenon happening in specialized garment sector, whereas historically, because they've been able to move around everywhere, and because they've been so small, you haven't been able to actually make those demands on the workers, because the workers aren't able to make those demands, because when they make those demands, capital, transnational capital, the buyers, are able to simply cut and run the next, you know, cheapest supplier factory. Right now, because you have greater capacity at the Global South, so that means greater, not only capacity to negotiate against the brands, but shifting the relationship between brands, between a supplier and the buyer dramatically. It's also shifting, as a consequence, as a knock-on effect, it's shifting the relationship between workers in these facilities and suppliers. Now, just like in this note, it also, if you issue that value capture question, it also affords disparate points of attack. Whereas historically, if you have a number of factories and a number of workers working for those factories, it's very hard to coordinate because you have to make an argument around, look, it's a united enemy, that being capital. Now you can say, actually, it's the same employer, and so you can draw those links. And you saw that in both the Arvind case and the Yuyun case.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question about the hukou. You're right that this is absolutely essential to understanding migration in China, and understanding the hukou system is really important. For those who don't know, this is a system of household registration which classifies every resident of China as rural or urban, and also means that they are entitled to access state resources pretty much only in the place where they are registered. Yeah, you're right also, I think, very much to identify this as being connected to property rights, and particularly land rights. There are now very, I guess, controversial reforms of the hukou system, which were proposed a couple of months ago, which are going to apparently get rid of the rural-urban distinction. I've just written a paper about this, which I'm very happy to send you if you want.
Please, lovely.
But briefly, getting rid of the rural-urban distinction and having everybody as just as citizens hukou, I actually don't think is going to do very much. I think it'll be very important for symbolic value, but in real terms, for the migrant people I'm looking at, I can't see that it's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah.
First, because it doesn't change the fact that the goods and services you are entitled to in the place, your locality, your hukou 所在地, where you are registered, not in virtue of being rural or urban. Second, because as you mentioned, this question about rights to land, lots and lots of rural people, migrants, ultimately would not want to have an urban hukou or to get rid of their rural hukou unless there was some way for them to keep the land that is associated with it, which is, for migrants particularly, is an absolutely essential kind of fallback option. It's a form of insurance should their migration go wrong. And I think without fundamental reform of that, it's going to be very, very difficult for anything major to change for rural migrants.
Thank you very much, both of you, once again.